So where do we start when addressing Cassette Beasts? Probably the obvious. If you like Pokémon, this will at least pique your interest. Cassette Beasts is a creature collector, but a bit of a weird one. Let me also go ahead and mention I'm only using footage up to the first boss. Basically the tutorial section of the game, because it handholds you up until that point. I've completed about a third of the game's story at the time of writing, so now you know where I stand and why I'm using such early game footage to avoid spoilers, because this is actually an interesting story for a game. So, let's talk about the gameplay loop first before we actually start touching on the story. Gameplay is pretty reminiscent of a lot of other creature collectors. You and one companion head out and complete quests while collecting recordings of monsters. These recordings take the form of cassettes, which seems a bit odd, but gets explained in the story, so there's no point in diving into it here. When you are battling, you and your companion can take the form of any beast you've recorded, and you gain some traversal abilities by recording different beasts. So it's important for exploration as well. So more or less, instead of launching them out of a Pokeball, you'll pop in a cassette tape, and I guess whatever magical audio is playing over it transforms your character into the creature that you recorded the audio of. Future me jumping in here to add in one thing that I forgot. The battle system is actually a builder-spender type of system. So you have to do certain basic attacks to actually build up ability points, and then you spend them on the higher attacks. Not quite sure how I got all the way through recording the previous audio and forgot to mention that aspect of it, but there you go. Where things get interesting is that you can, after filling up a meter, and once you get to a certain point in the story, fuse with your companion. So functionally fuse two different beasts together and make a unique new creature. Now, it's functionally just the two individual beasts with all their moves merged into one, with one exception, but you don't open that up until companionship rank 2. So it's not like there's a huge number of changes in terms of what happens, but you get this nice aesthetic change where the fusion comes together and forms this brand new third creature. So while there's only 120 baseline creatures, the fusions add a whole lot of variety into the aesthetics of the game. There's also a lot of interesting gameplay strategies involving fusion, such as buffing just before fusing to boost the time of buffs or to play around with status effects. You really are just taking the two creatures and squishing them together. Personally, I think the fusion mechanic is more interesting in the sense that monsters can also appear as fusions as well, so it makes for some really unique encounters out in the wild and adds a lot of variety to overworld combat in the long run, and this is actually, from what I understand, part of where the endgame focus is. Obviously not at endgame, this is initial impressions video. Fusion aside, Cassette Beasts actually has pretty in-depth and thus complicated battle mechanics. Here's a screenshot of the weakness chart on the Cassette Beasts wiki. The thing that is interesting is stuff isn't just weak or strong to specific element types. They also gain buffs and debuffs. For example, if an earth type takes damage from a water type, it becomes eroded and its defenses drop. On the flip side, if you hit a poison type with a plant type attack, its attacks get buffed because you make poison stronger. There's also a handful of instances where a type change can happen, like hitting plastic with fire turns it into a poison type. The game is really good at explaining all of this, and if you have no issues keeping track of modern Pokemon's gigantic chart of type matchups, you won't have an issue here. Otherwise, it's not a bad thing to keep a chart handy, specifically because the whole addition of buffs and debuffs makes it just a touch more complicated than just this is stronger, this is weaker. Cassette Beasts doesn't seem to have followed along with some of the modern trends of being overly easy for this type of game either. Most beasts have the ability to gain a defensive move that will assist in blocking incoming damage, and you'll actually need to use these in more challenging fights. I'm sure you can overlevel in this game, at least to a point, but I haven't dug in far enough to know for sure yet. I usually don't mind overleveling, it generally happens because I explore quite a bit in these games. And I can see my level slowly sort of creeping past the areas that are appropriate for me to be in, but we'll address that in just a minute. Or I'll completely forget to go back to it and have to edit it in afterwards like I did the previous statement. So you learn moves from some of the beasts that you capture, and you need those moves to actually traverse the map. They're not terribly hard to get, and you can actually look up a pretty easy list of all the beasts that you should capture to get the traversal abilities. But it's worthwhile to throw that out there. This is a truly open world sort of map. So as long as you'll take the time to get the traversal moves, you can go pretty much anywhere you want to. But the monsters do get harder in progressively later and later game areas. Now granted, if you're grinding and you want to get your character's levels up there, you can do that. The game doesn't force you to take on the story or the quests in any particular order. So odds are pretty good if you force your way all the way through one particular quest line before addressing the others, you're probably going to end out over-leveled for at least one. And that's, I guess, goes back to me talking about potentially being able to be over-leveled. You can be, but there will always be somewhere or something to do in the game that will be appropriate for whatever level you're at. And it's also worth adding that unless I've missed something, the only time you evolve is when you're resting at a campfire, and it gives you the option to choose whether or not to evolve your monster. Evolutions are a little bit different in this game. Like, you can even change types. Say the creature that I'm playing as right now goes from its current seemingly ghostish form, and the form that I pick is actually earth element type. So keep that in mind. The evolution system in this is not quite like Pokemon. Alright, back to the main story. Outside of that specific scenario, the scenario of being over-leveled, you need to actually chain moves together in a way that makes them effective if you really want to reap the most rewards. For example, my companion currently has the ability to provoke, boost its own dodge, and put up a wall. Do I utilize this to win fights? Rarely, but that's because I'm a terrible player. Someone that actually pays a bit of attention could absolutely do this to make their gaming time more efficient and effective. Now, what about the story and progressing through the story itself? The game doesn't really force you to stick to one particular progression path. There are more than two, but the two quests that seem to be big drivers of the game to me are the quest to encounter all 6 Archangels and the quest to become a Ranger. Yes, I said Archangels. Tucking the Ranger quest line aside, that's more or less just this game's equivalent of the Gym Masters, but let's talk about the Archangels. The game is actually really Lovecraftian in its story. You basically wake up on a beach and find a town on an island where you're meeting people very clearly from different points in time and gain the ability to use a Sony Walkman to transform into monsters. But the Archangels are another level of creepy. You'll have your first encounter pretty quickly, and it's actually in the video. And it's the end of the tutorial section of the game. The screen starts to glitch and get staticky, and your companion starts talking about the weird effect this environmental change is having on them. They also look like something out of a nightmare. I was going to insert a small clip at the second Archangel, but something happened with my OBS footage and it got distorted. Let's just say Evil Puppet Master from Hell. At least that's the second one I encountered. On top of the straight up obvious weirdness with Archangels, there's also a cult to deal with in typical Lovecraftian fashion, and evil real estate brokers. But that's all we're going to touch on in the story. I'm not a real big fan of giving out spoilers, so we're just going to avoid them from that point out. Just from looking around, it seems like the endgame is typical collector endgame, where you try and finish finding all the different creatures and can finish up any side quests you haven't completed, as well as probably do some of this game's equivalent of shiny hunting. Which I guess I should touch on that. The shiny system in this is more shiny adjacent than a shiny replacement. You can find some rare versions of beasts out in the open, and they are elemental shifts of the original beast. Now there's 13 different elemental types, so there's a lot of possibilities for finding different beasts with different elements, and it does tweak their color scheme a bit. The reason why I say it's shiny adjacent is because it's not quite as rare from what I understand that shinies are. And there is some gameplay strategy to this, because what happens is you're able to use a different set of stickers on the cassette than what you would normally be able to use. Oh, and I haven't mentioned stickers yet, have I? Stickers can be added to any tape to modify the abilities of the beast. Think HMs and TMs, but both more straightforward and more complex at the same time. Say more straightforward because you can equip and unequip stickers, but more complex because you can find variants of the stickers that have extra effects beyond just the baseline ability, and one of the best ways to find these is as you rank up your monster, or your beast, it will sometimes have rare variants of these stickers on it if it's a rare variant itself, and these bootleg versions have a higher likelihood of having the rare variants. So remember how I mentioned earlier that the combat system in this is pretty intricate? You should be starting to get the picture as to why now. So, what do I actually think of the story itself? There's a bit of quirkiness at the beginning and some obvious millennialisms in the writing, but don't let that put you off. You'll see a few characters speak in a way that is very reminiscent of early 2000s and 2010s. And that seems to be like it's going to be one of those games at first, but it's absolutely not. A lot of the silliness gets wiped way the hell out when you fight the first Archangel. The level of seriousness it introduces actually sort of takes some of that humor and puts it more into perspective. It's still there afterwards, but it becomes clear this isn't just a romp through the park, and the story is a bit more adult-oriented than it might at first seem. There's a strong air of mystery about what is going on, and every character makes it clear they are there just as much against their will as you are. No one came to the island voluntarily, at least as far as I'm aware yet, and everyone is either trying to just live as normally as they can or interested in figuring out the same thing as you, which is how to get home. So think from, but less smiling death creatures that appear at night, and more just you're trapped on an island with creatures that you would think of as monsters from our reality, but in there it's just more or less animals, except the Archangels. Overall, I'm really enjoying my experience with it, so much so that I went ahead and picked up a second copy for my Switch, which did that because it's a lot easier for me to be able to pick up and play the Switch in bits and pieces. Absolutely recommend it. And with the sequel having just been announced, there's no better time to really test it out and see if you want to jump into the series at large. And that pretty much wraps up all of my initial thoughts on Cassette Beasts, and with that, just keep in mind, if I can beat it, so can you.